lady next to me was saying, was it on?
Yes, it is on.
No.
Is that, yeah. Sorry, I have a habit of forgetting that I need to put it near my mouth. It's my great pleasure to introduce Saskia, who is a fellow of Peterhouse College in Cambridge. She's going to say something about herself and her research, but I am very thrilled indeed to be having this talk, because the Beguines, it sounds very exotic actually, they're a fascinating group of women, and looking forward to it very much. So if you don't have a handout, would you mind sharing? I've got a couple of spares here, but so over to you, Sister.
Thank you. Thank you. Can you hear that? No. Right. Is that going to be better? No? I'll have to hold it. Can you hear that?
Yes.
Right. I'm sorry if I lose connection. Just so that you know who you're listening to, I'm afraid I'm entirely educated in the other place. And I started life as a modern linguist because my family's Dutch, and at Cambridge at the time that I went there, they had a really, really good program of medieval languages and literature. And one of the languages they taught was Dutch. And I was interested in Dutch medieval literature. So I went to Cambridge. And then I stayed there, and it was in my undergraduate time that I learned about Hadewijch, because she's one of the great poets of in the Dutch language. And I then subsequently did my PhD on her. And it was really in the course of my PhD that I became more and more interested in what she was saying, rather than in how she was saying it. People in languages faculties and who work on literature are very much interested in how something is being said. And I did a sort of sideways shuffle and put myself into the divinity faculty, where people were much more interested in the what that she was saying. Because it seemed to me that she and her contemporaries took significant risks to say what they thought was important. And for us then to turn around and ignore what they were saying and simply saying, oh, didn't they do it well, was sort of missing the point and not honouring what they were trying to do in their own lifetimes. So I thought I'd start today and give you a brief history of the Beguines. The Beguines was a lay religious movement of women that was about parallel with the Franciscans and the Dominicans. They started out in the early 13th century, and their aim was to serve God in among the people. The great tendency at the time, and perhaps also partly now, was to serve God in big, beautiful churches behind the walls of convents and monasteries, rather than in among the sick and the poor on the streets. And it was the Franciscans and the Dominicans who did this for the men, and the Beguines sought to do this for women. Of course, as women, what they couldn't do was they couldn't go out and beg. So what they did instead was that they worked for their living. And many of them were working in the wool towns, making cloth and tapestries along the Rhine. The church in the early part of that 13th century was feeling besieged particularly by the Cathar heresy in the south of France, who were positioning themselves as even more holy than anything that the Catholic Church could produce. And the Dominicans were very much charged with going out and fighting that heresy. And the Beguines were being held up in that early 13th century as an example of very holy women who were within the Catholic Church. So they were, as it were, the sort of the orthodox, acceptable Catholic counterpoint to the Cathar heretics. And one of the things that made them, as it were, even more holy, and it was Robert Vostes who pointed this out, was the fact that they didn't beg, but they worked for their living. And these women in the early 13th century were mostly from aristocratic families or high-level merchant families, so they had not been used to working for their living. But they were out there, they were working, and this was an example of their holiness, if you like. Unfortunately, the strong parallels between the Beguines and the Cathars turned out very much it turned out to be rather unfortunate later on in the 13th century, because of course, having underlined how similar to the Cathars these women were, it became very easy to accuse them of heresy. And sadly, so if they didn't do what the local parish priests or the local dignitaries wanted, it was a very easy target to have them accused of heresy, and there were numbers who died at the stake as a result. So it did rather backfire, if you like, on the Beguines. One of the reasons that they became so unpopular with the parish clergy in the course of the 13th century was that precisely because they were being pointed out as being extremely holy and extremely devout women, they were then held up also, they tended to be the model for behaviour in the parish, and these women preferred to go to the churches run by the Dominicans than by their local parish priests. And of course, because they sort of led the charge, if you like, towards the Dominicans, the local parish churches also started to feel the loss of parishioners, as parishioners too went to the Dominicans. And one of the things is, of course, that where you worship tends to be where you leave your money. And I may be cynical, but I rather suspect that it was the fact that many people were leaving their money to the Dominicans rather than to the local parish priests that really fueled the dislike of the church for the Beguines. The 13th century proceeded in that kind of way, and then we had in the early part of the 14th century, there were three things that happened. One was the Council of Vienne in 1310. One was the burning at the stake of Marguerite Porete in, I think it's 1308. And the other one was the posthumous accusation of Eckhart for heresy in the 1320s. The Council of Vienne came up with a wonderful statement. They said, all Beguines are heretics. And then there was a comma, and they said, except those who aren't. But it did rather put women off from writing about their experiences, because that was the particular problem. It was writing about their spiritual experiences in their own languages as opposed to in Latin. And that's what got Eckhart as well, the fact that he was writing in German, not in Latin. Now, in the handout, I have given you, I'm not proposing to go, as it were, through the whole thing, but I gave you, just as an example, some pages from a book that was recently translated into English about the Beguines, particularly because that list of Beguinage gives you a sense of how many there were. It was an incredibly big movement. There were thousands of them. And they started out in groups of perhaps 2-3 women living possibly in their own houses or in a house that belonged to one of them. And then they attracted other like-minded women, and they grew, and I think it was such a mass movement that we can't quite conceive of anything like it now. But these lists of the Beguines gives you a sense of quite how prevalent they were. I also thought, just for interest, you might like some pictures. Georgie had said, did I want to do a PowerPoint? And I said, no, I just sort of stand and talk, feeling rather sort of low tech, but I thought perhaps you might like some pictures. The Beguines, these are pictures of 1 painting and 3 photographs of 4 of the Beguines in Belgium. Quite recently, you can see they were taken in the 1950s, 1930s. This was a movement that continued right on into the last century. I was in touch with a woman in the 1980s who was thinking of becoming a Beguine, and I believe the last professed Beguine died, I think it was only last year. So this was a movement that continued from the early 13th century, although it did of course change. These Beguinages are much bigger than anything that Hadewijch would ever have been aware of. They tended to be little cities within a city and had their own regulations. They were often, travel by water was so much more comfortable than travel by road that they tended to be on rivers. They often did laundry, so they had big grass areas in the middle of the little town, as it were, on which they could bleach the sheets. They often had schools, they had a hospital, because they were in the business of looking after people, looking after the poor, looking after children and the sick. They didn't take vows of stability. They took vows of obedience to the mistress of the Beguines, but they didn't take the sort of standard vows of a nun. We think that Hadewijch was a Beguine. I say this a little cautiously because we actually know nothing really about her at all. Oh, that worked rather well. I can hear the effect of the loudspeaker. We know very little about her. All we have is her texts. This has been extremely frustrating for those of us who would like to know a little bit more about her. She has, in her texts, she writes only about the soul's relationship to God. She doesn't write about anything that can really place her in time. The one exception is on this little bit of the handout where it says Hadewijch. We think that she was writing between about 1230 and 1250, and that is on the basis of this list of the perfect ones. Now, some people have said it probably isn't by her, but it's in the manuscripts of other works by her, and it's the only thing that has enabled us even to get anywhere close to a date. In it, she mentions there are 2 things that she actually mentions which we've been able to link to real events. One is a Beguine who was killed by Meester Robert. We think that was a particularly unsavory inquisitor called Robert Le Bougre, who was active in Flanders round about in the 1230s, and there was certainly a Beguine called Hadewijch, I think her name was, who was burnt at the stake by him in 1236. So that's one anchor. The other thing she mentions is in the list is the saints who live on the walls of Jerusalem. The saints who live on the walls of Jerusalem. Thank you very much for pointing it out. I'm sorry. I'll try to be a bit more disciplined with this thing. Jerusalem fell to the Khwarezmians in August 1244, and they ensured that there were no Christians living in or around Jerusalem after that date. So, given the fact that news would travel fast, but not as fast as it does today, we assume that that list, whether it was by her or not, was probably written before about 1245, 1250. The 5 manuscripts of her work are very closely related, and which hasn't been very helpful, though there are others. Some of the texts were copied from manuscripts that we no longer have. So we know that there were once more manuscripts than we have now. She wrote 14 visions, 31 letters, 45 poems in stanzas, which is it's those poems and stanzas that she's particularly famous for, because they are quite astonishingly, they're extremely good poems and show a mastery of form and language that is really quite remarkable. And then 16 letters, I've called them here epistolary poems, but they're sort of letters and tracts in rhyming couplets. These other texts that I put under further texts are ones that have been at somewhat of a question mark about whether she wrote them or not. My own feeling is that the question mark, the reason there is a question mark over these texts is a product of the sequence in which the manuscripts were discovered rather than the product of the texts themselves. Had manuscript C, for example, been found first, then I think they would all have been considered to be genuine Hadewijch. But I could go into a long and complicated explanation, but it probably is a bit more than we need today. These poems in stanzas, for which he is principally known, and are very remarkable. She was writing in the form of the French courtly love lyric. And at the back of the handout, I've got an English translation. I thought it was probably more useful to do just an English translation than the Dutch version. But if you look at that is an example of one of these poems. And you can see in it some of the features. Oops, I find myself now one-handed.
You can put it on your lapel.
There we are. Well, it didn't reach. I was going to, but then people said they couldn't hear me. I'll try. Right, I will try. And if you can't hear me,
That's fine.
That's better? Good. If you look at this is poem number 3. And these poems in stanzas, they're obviously in stanzas, they're written in the form of the courtly love lyric, which has a number of sort of very formal features. One is that they all start with the Natureingang. The first stanza talks about nature and contrasts it to her own experience, to the voice of the poet's own actual experience. The other thing about these, the courtly love lyric, is that they were addressed to a distant and extremely demanding lady. You need to think of the historical context of this, and that the men in the castle were tended to be out fighting, and what were left behind were the young men and the wife, the lady of the house. And this tended to create a lot of young men who were frantically in love with the lady of the house. So what you tended to have was this courtly love lyric which developed, which was a poetry of love and longing that was never going to actually lead to anything. So you had all this expression of love and devotion and seeking to serve at the highest possible level of service and humility by young men to this distant and difficult lady. Hadewijch picks this up, turns it round, and what she does is she gives herself the voice of the man, and she talks, the distant lady is God. And this works because the word she used for God is minne, which is love, which is a feminine noun in Dutch. So she talks about God entirely in the feminine person. she speaks in these poems of her experience of God as a changeable, fickle, highly demanding, highly unreasonable lover. It's very interesting because of her taking the masculine voice. In this poem, you'll see, unfortunately, English doesn't do gender in language very well, so you could read this in English and be unaware of what's going on in terms of the gender differences. But you get a few little clues, even here in line 25 or 26, she talks about her shield. She talks about herself as a warrior. What is very interesting is these texts have been studied for many years, and it's always been accepted. Yes, they were in the tradition of the Troubadour love lyric. We always knew that the Troubadour love lyrics were sung, but as soon as anyone suggested that possibly these poems too were intended to be sung, hands were thrown up in horror at such a sacrilegious notion that somehow these would actually have been sung. When you're working with the text in the original language, it's very interesting because you can see that she always is playing with words, with homonyms and puns and ambiguity, to try to create in her audience something of the experience that she had of her experience of God. And these puns and homonyms work when you're listening to them, when you hear them. When you're reading a text, your eyes capture the next bit of the sentence as you're reading, so it doesn't come as such a surprise, whereas if you're just hearing, the meaning of a word can take you by surprise as it shifts along through as the sentence proceeds. So it was quite obvious that these texts were meant to be read out loud or listened to rather than read by sort of silently the way we read them now. But it has been very, very difficult indeed to persuade the powers that be that they might have been sung. Fortunately, there were some very determined young scholars in Belgium who were doing research on the actual form that she used, of the form of the text that she wrote, the rhyme schemes, the stress patterns, and they thought that they would just see whether there were any French poems that were also similarly, with similar stress and rhyme patterns. And they were able to identify some. And that's an example also of her astonishing mastery of language, because if you think about the way French works, it doesn't grammatically work the same way that Dutch does. I mean, Dutch is a language which is almost as rigid as German is in terms of liking to have the verb at the end of the sentence. There are not all those lovely words which easily rhyme in Dutch either, so turning this into Dutch poetry that really worked as poetry was astonishing. And so these scholars in Belgium were looking, and they spotted that some of the poems, there were some French poems which had the same stress patterns and rhyme schemes as Hadewijch's poems, which had music set to them. So, this is breaking news, they have just produced a recording. I won't play you the whole thing because it is in Middle Dutch. So this is the poem that you're looking at. I think. Oops. No.
Die Degen nun uns Welt hinab, wogen Blumenland die Dach, dat sie überwinden Seelenharpine, die de Winterseele wach, und Hände Sommer trosten
That is really exciting because there have been long academic debates saying absolutely not, never ever could this ever have been sung. And it has been sung. Good stuff. Just one more thing that I just wanted to say about the history of the Beguines is that there is there's a Catholic order, Mary Ward and her English ladies, who set up, it's now known as the Congregation of Jesus, but in the 17th century she very much had the same sort of charism as these Beguines, wanting to go as women out into the world and serve people, serve God and other people out there. One of the effects of this gender reversal, that the most famous masculine version of it is perhaps Bernard of Clairvoy with his sermons on the Song of Songs, where he speaks entirely of his relationship, his soul's relationship to God as being the bride of Christ. So there he's speaking of himself, a powerful man, as a very weak woman. And we've got here Hadewijch doing the opposite, except also rather subtly reducing her power, because in the poem, in the form of the poems that she's chosen to write in, it's the woman who has the power and the man who doesn't. So once again, she is writing of herself by that gender reversal, by speaking of herself as a man, she is accepting the less powerful position. Very key to this kind of gender reversal is the acknowledgement of the total otherness of this relationship. The relationship between, because these were women who who may have come from families, who may have had children, in the same way that Bernard was addressing an adult community of men who might have been married or had amorous adventures before they ever became monks. These were women who many of whom will have been in families. But the important thing about this gender reversal is to indicate to them and to make real for them that this relationship was something completely other. It may be as passionate and as intimate, but it was totally other than anything that they had experienced in their ordinary life. One of the dichotomies that is prevalent in the Middle Ages is the man is to woman as soul is to body. Man is the divinity of Christ, woman is his humanity. These women took this very literally and took it as took it as an indication that they as women were really, potentially their suffering was really, in some sense, the suffering of Christ. That if they were the humanity, if woman was the humanity, that is a much more real equation. If man is the divinity, that has to be allegorical or a metaphor. But if woman is his humanity, then that makes unity with the Christ a possibility, because you can, as woman, be united with the humanity of Christ. And particularly, at what point can you reach that unity? You can reach it at the point of suffering. It is the fact that the suffering, it's the suffering in which you can come somewhere close to the suffering of Christ on the cross. The other women, the other Beguines, had a similar, very positive view of suffering. Now I'm going to explain that in a minute. Mechthild of Magdeburg, and there are translations of her work out there which will insist on translating Huisvrouw as housewife. Housewife gives totally the wrong impression. When she said Huisvrouw, what she was talking about was the lady of the house, the lady of the castle, not the person who stands and does the washing up. At least that's my experience of being a housewife. She says at one point in her work, "Lord, what shall we now say of love, now that we lie together on the bed of my pain?" This sense that pain and suffering was where you encountered Christ and where you could be unified. You could gain that union that was the ultimate aim of these mystic women. When I say that she had a positive view of suffering, I very much do not mean that she was inclined to inflict it on herself. It's very interesting, all these early women are very clear that you do not do things to bring suffering upon yourself. There are one or two women of whom we have texts they wrote, and we also have hagiographies that were written about them, and it's by priests. And it's extremely interesting that they, in the texts that they wrote, speak of the importance of bearing suffering patiently, and that, in that sense, it as a positive. But they also speak about not doing things, not self-harming, to use a modern term. Parallel to this, that's their view, is the male hagiographer's view that these women did self-harm, and that self-harming was somehow part of their virtue, part of their saintliness. There's no evidence from these early women that they did, but of course what you saw with the later generations of women, they were presented with a view of female saintliness which involved self-harming. So you do find that later on, sort of 100 years later, 150 years later, there are women who self-harm as a means of reaching a greater degree of sanctity. But I would argue that what they're doing is they are copying behaviors that they have read about in texts written by men, not in the texts written by the original women. So they are copying a view of what was appropriate behavior for women that was not actually theirs. Sorry, that's the end of my little rant on feminine self-harming. If you'd just like to have a quick look at some of these other texts, how am I doing for time? Am I doing okay? I will be very grateful for questions afterwards, because one of the difficulties of dealing with a subject as vast as this is that I could stand here and talk for hours and still not talk about the one thing that somebody in this audience would really like to hear about. So if you would save up any questions that you have, and I'd be very happy to answer them as much as I can. On this first sheet, which just says quotations at the top, sorry for the sort of Heath Robinson nature of the handouts. They were done in a bit of a hurry. Here we have from letter 6, with the humanity of God you must live here on earth, in the labours and sorrow of exile, and with the eternal and omnipotent God you shall love and rejoice inwardly in sweet sanctuary, and the truth of both is a single jubilation. And then I love this other sentence which I included really because it's so sort of, suddenly you hear the sort of humanity of this woman coming out. She says, we all indeed wish to be God with God, but God knows there are few of us who want to live as man with his humanity. And it is that living as man with his humanity, and that is the moment of, that is the only place where you can get that sense of union. Which you'll see again in this, from her vision, she is told about the eighth gift of love, which is when love no longer gives herself, so that the Beguines, Hadewijch, is acutely aware of her loss, of her lack of love, and that lack creates such a deep desire for love that deep desire becomes as great as love. And it is in the depth of the misery of the sense of loss, that is where the possibility is for the union with the immensity of the love that is God. Another example of that is in the epistolary poem where she speaks about hell is the highest name for love. And although this is from the text, the translation by Mother Columba Hart, which, as I said, has two problems. I mean, that this is not Mother Columba Hart's fault. One is that it's written in English, so you can't tell the genders, and the other is she is inclined to capitalize the word love when she thinks it probably referred to God the Son. Whereas one of the glorious things about Hadewijch's use of the word love is Minne doesn't, Minne, you can't tell when you're reading the word Minne whether it's a noun, part of a verb, or quite what function it plays. So you are tending to have to guess your way around a sentence as to what it might mean. And I'm absolutely certain that that was done deliberately by Hadewijch. So she speaks here about love. It could be the experience of loving, or it could be the relationship with God. Hell is the seventh name of love wherein I suffer. There's nothing love does not engulf and damn. No one who falls into her and whom she seizes comes out again, because no grace exists there. Hell turns everything to ruin. In love nothing else is required but disquiet and torture without pity. Forever to be in unrest, forever assault and new persecution. It's not very pretty, I have to say. And it's it is the vision, what she shows us of what her experience of this loving God through the awareness of lack, and it is the awareness of the lack of God that is the really deep suffering. And so it is that it's more a psychological suffering, if you like, than a physical suffering that she goes through. For her, again, if you now look at the poems in stanzas 27, she says at one point there, mich gruwelt dat ik leve. it is horrible. I shudder that I live. It is horrible to me that I live. The contrast in what she is seeking for, which is the expanse of light and joy, of love, and what she has, which is the darkness, and the weight of her sorrows. Dat getal dieren rouwen moet zijn gezwegen. Die grote zware wagen blieven ongewegen. The numbers of sorrows, you can't talk about them. The weight, you cannot weigh them. If you then go through into the next poem again, then I've just picked bits from different poems. Here she's talking about the pain, and that it's a completely ununderstandable wonder that she has been captured by, which causes her to wander in a wild desert. And the cruelty, the cruelty of that desert landscape. It's quite interesting. Different. When you see the word desert, there is sometimes the inclination to somehow assume that everybody uses desert in the same way. But actually, you can see if you're looking at the ways that, if you actually unpick what's happening in the deserts, you find that they're very different places. Hadewijch here is talking about a desert that is harking back to the passage in Numbers, where they are wandering in the desert on their way to the promised land. She is struggling her way through a desert, through the desert of loss, through the desert of the agony of the absence of God, in order to reach the promised land of union, the land of milk and honey, which is the land of the divinity and the ever-flowing divinity and humanity and love of Christ. Later texts will talk about the desert also, but they will more refer to the text in Hosea, where the desert is where you encounter God. So that is where the Beguine wishes to stay, because that is where God is. Whereas you've got, in Hadewijch, it's very clear that the desert is something which you are struggling to get through. A few examples of the way she plays with words. In lyric poem 26, she writes, she is generous and pours full measure. Those who drink with her, she causes to pay in blood. But that schinken, which I translated there as pouring, can also mean to cause pain. So she is generous and causes full measure of pain. Those who drink with her pay in blood. But as this is being read to you, or sung to you, you wouldn't necessarily realize which meaning of that word was being referred to. Another way that which she illustrates this business of receiving within lack, having this sense of unity with God within that intense sense of lack, is in another quotation here, where she uses the word dogen. And dogen can both mean virtue and suffering. So these two meanings are sort of slipping through each other in the course of the poem. And she says, so shall you always seek new virtue, or it might be suffering, for love. See in what suffering or virtue I have lain, which you are not prepared to suffer or practice. So then desire virtue or suffering, so that you may rise higher. And all the time she's playing with these different meanings to try to create, I think, in her audience something of what she felt when she was in her encounters with God. I think the last thing I'd just like to do is read you in Dutch, I'm afraid, this bit of the last bit of the Epistrophe 15, where you get some sense of the way she used the word minne, and she's trying to create in people that a sense of the overwhelming, puzzling, and yes, totally over the top experience of love. She writes, I minne waar ik minne en de met minne minne u minne. I minne om minne gevet dat minne de minne al minne vol kinne. And it doesn't make a lot more sense if you understand the Dutch. I think I'd probably better call a halt at that point if anybody's got any questions.
Going back to the beginning, you talked about the fact that they thought it was being very holy because they were. And how did that reflect on the orders that were contemplative didn't work? Did they see that as a criticism and were resentful, or did the church just hold to ideas, working and not working?
I think the contrast the church was holding at that point was between working and begging. In a sense, the orders of nuns who were behind their enclosures and whose work was prayer were held in a different category. And they also, it was that they were honoured because their work was prayer. It was more the fact that they were earning their living, not begging. Sorry, you had a question as well.
Was it the case that Hadewijch's work circulated only within the context of the Beguines? Because I can imagine that some of the poems that you've given us to look at, if they were encountered outside that context, might be thought to be secular love poems, right? Mm. So I wondered if they've always been understood as mystical works in every context.
They didn't have a very wide circulation. They were known by Ruysbroek and the Blessed John of Groenendaal, but they were clearly written for her community. When they were first discovered, they were thought of as being, when the manuscript was first rediscovered, it was thought of as being potentially a secular love poem. But then its context with the other texts that were there, people then started to identify it as being the Hadewijch that Ruysbroek mentions. There's a long period when she's not really known or spoken about or anything. She must have been known. She must have been an incredibly difficult woman, I think, so demanding. And so, in some of her letters, it looks as though she was actually pushed out of her community, possibly because her demands were her standards were just too high. And there's this long period where we don't really know what happened to the manuscripts were just sitting around in monastic libraries. But there's not any very great evidence that they were read. Unlike, interestingly enough, the work of Marguerite Porete, although both she and her work were burnt in Paris, that circulated very widely. Within about sort of 25, 30 years of her death, it was circulating around Europe. being said that it had been written by an extremely holy monk.
Where does the word begin come from?
That is a mystery. There are lots of possible theories, but we don't actually really know. They certainly didn't have a founder, so it's not as though there was a suggestion that it came from a saint called Beguines, but they didn't have a founder. There was Marie Toigny, who was one of the first Beguines in Belgium. It's also thought that it may have come because of the similarity of the word Albigensian, and because they were like the Cathars, and it was partly, therefore, potentially an insult. They were called Beguines in an insulting kind of way, and of course, then the way with these insults, they then started to wear that as a badge of honour. It's very unclear where the word comes from. It doesn't come from Lambert-le-Bègue either, as far as one can tell, although that has been suggested too.
There's a lot of interest coming back in Beguinage in France anyway, people wanting to form communities like that.
Yeah. Yes, I think it's a very interesting model, because these women, one of the problems of trying to define what the Beguinage were in those early periods was that they were different in different towns, they were different in the same town at different periods. So there wasn't a clear model, because it wasn't like an order that had rules and everybody followed the same regulations. You could join a Beguinage temporarily, and you could then leave again. They did actually later on start having regulations that if you left, it was all very well, but you couldn't take your property back out again with you, because it got rather inconvenient when somebody joined a Beguinage with a house, and all the other Beguines came and lived in her house, and then she decided to leave and wanted her house back, and then the Beguinage disappeared, all these Beguines became homeless. So it was then they did start having those kinds of regulations, but the idea of being able to come together as a group of like-minded people and in service to the community is actually very much what the modern incarnations of religious orders are becoming as well.
I would.
Yeah. Sorry.
I take it that the Beguines never got as far as beach shores. If they didn't, why do you think that was?
Well, there's a lovely phrase in a medieval manuscript about Norwich, which has been taken as the possibility that there may have been a group of Beguines in East Anglia. Of course, and you can see how that might be, because there was all that connection with the wool trade and linen workers. So you could see how they might well have come in to the big wool centres like Norwich. Unfortunately, apart from this one sentence, there's been no other evidence found. So that's another one of these tantalising little things. And the sentence could simply refer to a group of women who are living together and in a sense behaving like Beguines, but not taking on that particular label. I think the church in England, and I'm going slightly out on a limb here, but I think the church in England has, in a sense, been more inclined towards having hermits and anchorites who live on their own, rather than these informal groupings of women. The sort of the Celtic tradition of a hermit in a wood, rather than the European tradition, which was of course, at the time that the Beguines started, it was also the time of the growth of the cities. So you had all these people coming into cities. So you had these groups of people in cities rather than the isolated saints out in the woods and in the countryside.
I wanted to ask you, when you were talking about the walk through the desert, it sounded incredibly lonely, and I just wondered where the sense of community, if at all, apart from living in the same area, as it were, were they as one, theologically and spiritually?
You know, that's a very interesting question, because actually it's all individual, and it really is that if you look at the poems stanzas, which are talking as love poems, it's me, the lover knight, to the distant demanding lady, and I as lover knight am competing against you as lover knight, as it were, of the same lady. So it is very much doing it on your own. And yeah, although they did it in community, I said, but all her texts are about the soul's own struggle with the sense of loss. Yeah.
The other thing I wanted to ask, if you would kindly expand a little on this sense of developing the humanity with Christ's full humanity. Yeah, it's the microphone seems to have lost its. I was just saying that the full humanity of Christ, that seemed to be where you were going at that point.
That the only place where we as creatures of God can come close to being equal with Christ in his humanity is in the depth of the isolation of the cry from the cross, and that is the one place where we can have the ambition of becoming one, of of in some sense sharing in that experience, and that's where she's going with all that poetry.
I'm meant to shout, but I think we will stand there at 12:30, but I feel as if we've been treated to a tantalising appetizer, as it were. Sorry, I can't. No, it keeps. It's not working. It's not working.
So I gave you. I wanted to give you handouts because I thought then you've got something else to take away and think about. The two, I think you've got one of the pages I photocopied was the history of the Beguines, the book of the history of the Beguines. The other one was Mother Columba Hart's translation of not all Hadewijch's texts, but most of her texts. That gives you somewhere, if you're interested, that gives you somewhere to start. You can find me at Peterhouse. You're welcome to send me emails, and this is a subject that I love very dearly, so I'm always happy to talk about it.